Hi, I'm Kalis. At my own wedding, my mother-in-law grabbed the mic, looked me dead in the eye, and spat, "She's just a beggar. She gets nothing." 600 people heard her call me a stain, a gold digger, a charity case. And my husband? He just looked down, like a boy scared of his mommy. But I didn't cry. I smiled, because what she didn't know was that my father was there too. And when he stood up, what he said made her face go white, and her hand? Drop the mic. Before we dive in, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Drop a comment. We read everyone. The room buzzed with soft music and the clinking of champagne flutes. The chandelier light shimmered off 1,000 sequins stitched into the hem of my wedding gown, but none of it touched me. Not really. Not with Valora's eyes fixed on me like I'd spilled red wine across her ivory rug. I walked into that ballroom knowing I wasn't the bride in her eyes, just the girl who somehow made it through the front door. I could hear the whispers as we made our entrance. Isn't she that girl from Garland? No family on her side? They say her mother passed. Quite a story, actually. And yet I kept walking, not just because I was expected to, but because my mother had once told me, "Never bow your head, not even when your shoes don't match." That voice echoed as I touched the tram in my hair, an old Vietnamese hairpin she'd given me before she died. Simple, elegant, mine. Jordan squeezed my hand for half a second. That was all. Then he turned to greet his colleagues, laughing a little too loud. I kept scanning for my father, finally spotting him seated at the far end of the room, quiet, watching. He hadn't said much all day, not since the ceremony. But he was here. That mattered. Then Valora stepped up. She hadn't smiled once during the ceremony, but now, as the MC handed her the mic for a toast, she looked positively gleeful. I stood by Jordan's side, uncertain whether to feel honored or braced for impact. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice syrupy with performance. "What a stunning evening! What a generous son I have." A few polite laughs. She let the silence stretch. "I remember when Jordan first brought her home," she continued. "I asked, 'Is this your friend from that community kitchen project?'" Her tone mocked innocence, but everyone could hear it, the way she emphasized project. I didn't move. "She's got grit, I'll give her that," she went on. "Came from nothing. Had nothing. Still doesn't, really. But hey, every family needs a good charity story, right?" Some guests chuckled, nervous, confused. Others looked down at their glasses. Jordan didn't speak, didn't look at me. He just stared at the floor, his mouth pulled tight like a man waiting for a storm to pass. I stood there, still and straight, no blinking, no flinching. Valora kept going. "And now, she gets to wear white, stand beside my son, and call herself part of this family. Life really is full of surprises." I reached up and gently adjusted the tram in my hair. That was my only answer. Have you ever stood in a room full of people who are supposed to celebrate you and felt completely alone? Would you have walked out or stood still like I did? I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I smiled. Not a forced smile. Not the polite kind you wear when an ant pinches your cheeks too hard. No, mine was steady, solid, quietly defiant. The kind of smile my mother wore when our electricity was cut off and she lit candles like we were having a special dinner. The kind she wore when neighbors muttered behind her back and she baked them cinnamon rolls anyway. A smile that said, "You won't break me, no matter how hard you try." I remembered all the subtle ways Valora had tried before this night, commenting on how I hold a fork a little funny, or how some fabrics just weren't made for certain complexions, invitations that were lost in the mail. The gift she gave me last Christmas, a budgeting book wrapped in gold ribbon. All of it now made sense. This wasn't just a moment, it was a culmination. And still, I smiled. That smile must have unnerved her because she paused, just for a moment, but it was long enough for the room to feel it. Then, behind me, I heard movement, a rustle, murmurs. Someone stood up. I turned my head slightly. My father. He'd been sitting quietly at the edge of the room all night, barely touched his food, hadn't spoken to anyone but me. A man of few words, fewer expressions. The kind of man people forget is in the room, until they don't. He stood slowly, straightened his jacket, and the room went still. Valora's face twitched, just a little. I hadn't seen him speak in public since my mother's funeral. I held my breath. Then I heard his voice, calm, low, but sharp as a blade. "Valora," he said calmly, like he was speaking to a student who'd forgotten her place in class, "do you remember coming to me back in the winter of '94, begging me for $5,000 to save your father's hardware store?" The silence was so deep, I could hear the ice melt in someone's glass behind me. I turned slightly, just enough to catch Valora's reaction. Her posture stiffened, and her hand, still clenching the mic, visibly trembled. "You called me a savior that day," my father went on, voice still low but cutting clean. "Said you'd never forget my kindness. You wept in my office, swore you'd repay me in full, and I never asked you to." He paused, let the weight of it hang in the air. "But tonight," he said, looking directly at her, "you call me the father of a beggar?" Somewhere near the back, a woman gasped. Others stared into their wine glasses as if they'd suddenly found the meaning of life in the bubbles. Valora opened her mouth, then closed it. My father didn't need volume. His presence spoke louder than anything she had said. Even the DJ, who had been quietly fiddling with sound levels, froze. He took one step forward. "You want your guests to think this marriage is charity?" he said, never raising his voice. "But the truth is, I raised a woman with more grace in her silence than you've managed in your entire performance tonight." I stared at him. This man who rarely spoke in public, who never tried to win a crowd, but now he was standing in front of hundreds of people, defending me. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "She's not my blood, but she is my daughter." There it was. Whispers rippled through the crowd. I saw a few heads turn toward each other in subtle disbelief. "She was barely 5, he continued, his gaze softening now as it met mine. "We found her sitting alone on a church bench after the shelter had no more room. She had one shoe, a scraped knee, and wouldn't speak for days." A slow ache bloomed in my chest. "We didn't take her in out of pity," he said. "We chose her. My wife combed her hair every morning, packed her school lunch, read bedtime stories twice when she was scared. We gave her our name, our home, and every bit of love we had." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small photo, folded and faded. He held it up. This was her first school picture. My wife had pinned a tiny trim in her hair that morning, said it was for courage. My breath caught. That memory. I'd buried it for so long. I could still remember the feeling of that brush through my tangles, my mother's voice humming some old melody I never figured out the words to, the smell of lemon balm in her hair, and the way she pinned that trim, not as decoration, but as armor. "She's worth more than any of your wine-soaked pedigree," he said, eyes still locked on Valora, "and I'm proud to be called her father." Have you ever felt more loved by someone who didn't share your blood? I did, every single day of my childhood, because love isn't DNA. It's consistency, it's sacrifice, it's kindness when no one's watching. Valora stood frozen, like someone who'd misjudged the room and suddenly realized it. Jordan. Jordan still hadn't moved, still looking at the floor. His hands were stuffed into his pockets now, his tie loosened, like he couldn't bear the weight of the moment. But I noticed something I hadn't before. Some of the guests, people who had snickered earlier, were now looking at me differently. Their expressions weren't pitying, they were embarrassed. Some nodded, a few even clapped softly. The sound didn't last long, but it was enough. And yet, my heart didn't swell, it ached. Because it shouldn't have been my father speaking first, it should have been my husband. Jordan should have stepped forward when his mother took the mic, should have stopped her before she twisted our wedding into her own social platform. But he hadn't, and the silence from him, that was what hurt the most. I stepped down from the stage, not in a rush, no dramatic flourish, just calm, certain steps, my heels quiet against the hardwood. My father stepped aside. We exchanged no words. We didn't need to. He nodded. I nodded back. That was enough. As I passed Jordan, he reached for my hand. I paused, looked down at his fingers, and gently pulled mine away. He looked up at me then. Finally, his eyes searching. I met them without blinking. "You didn't protect me," I said softly. "Not from her, and not from yourself." Then I turned away. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. He called my name softly, but by then I was already walking toward the door. The ballroom doors closed behind me with a soft thud, muffling the music and chatter inside. I kept walking until I reached the edge of the parking lot, heels crunching against the gravel, breath rising like smoke in the cold night air. A few guests wandered out for a smoke or a phone call, but no one said a word to me. I didn't expect them to. I leaned against a lamppost, arms crossed, coat barely shielding me from the wind that picked up across the lot. The sky above was cloudless, sharp, endless, just like the silence between Jordan and me. And yet, the silence I remembered most right then didn't belong to tonight. It was Thanksgiving, 2 years ago. The house smelled of buttered yams and burnt rolls, and Valora had just topped off her 3rd glass of Merlot. I'd stepped out of the kitchen, holding a stack of plates, and paused just outside the dining room when I heard her voice. Low, snide. "She'll never be one of us," she said, laughing lightly to her cousin. "She's just here to make Jordan look generous." I remember gripping those plates harder than I should have. One chipped against the wall when I turned too fast. No one noticed. Or maybe they did, and didn't care. That night, I smiled through dinner, poured her wine, passed the gravy. That was the thing with Valora. She didn't slap you in front of people. She sliced, slow and silent, where no one else could see. A car engine revved in the distance, pulling me back to the present. I looked toward the row of catering vans parked across the lot, their back doors open and crates stacked with untouched desserts. I was about to turn back toward the venue when another memory found me. This one heavier. Jordan's father had always been proud on the surface. Blazers in summer, monogrammed napkins, stories about the good old oil days. But I knew better. The debt started with poker nights, then a bad quarter, then a silent plea in the form of a red overdraft notice tucked under Jordan's gym bag. It was $40,000. I didn't tell Jordan. I didn't want to shame his father, not then. I paid it, quietly, had the mail rerouted to my address, never once mentioned it again. And still, that Christmas, Valora had looked me dead in the eye and said, "You should really start contributing to this family. Jordan has enough on his plate without taking care of you too." I just nodded. What would have been the point? Have you ever helped someone who later made you feel like a burden? Like your kindness was just another line on a receipt they'd never bother to read? That's what it felt like. Being invisible. Until it was convenient to throw a shadow on me. "Kalis?" The voice came from behind me. Soft, hesitant. I turned. It was Nadia, one of the catering assistants. She had a clipboard tucked under one arm and a tray of cutlery in the other. She stepped closer, voice lowered. I probably shouldn't say this, but I noticed something earlier, about the seating chart." My stomach sank. "What about it?" She shifted on her feet. "There was never a place card for you. I thought maybe it was a mistake. But your name, it just wasn't there, not even a table number." I stared at her, the wind catching my coat hem as if it too had recoiled. I thought maybe Jordan had changed something last minute. But the table you ended up at? It was labeled overflow, like the extras, people who RSVP'd too late. Overflow. The word sliced through me cleaner than anything Valora had said to my face. The chair by the kitchen, the server who forgot my plate, the confused glances when I sat down. It had all been deliberate, I clenched my fists inside my pockets, the fabric pulling tight against my knuckles. I didn't feel like crying, I felt hollow. Like my body had checked out and only the shape of me remained. Nadia touched my arm gently. "I'm so sorry. I just thought you should know." I nodded, unable to speak. She gave me one more look, then turned and disappeared into the kitchen entrance. I stood there for a while, the cold pressing deeper into my bones. My mind searched for something to hold on to, some piece of strength not yet chipped away. And then I heard it, echoing from a memory I hadn't revisited in years. My foster mother's voice, steady and sure. "Sometimes silence is the kindest revenge." But tonight, silence felt like surrender. I turned back toward the venue, not to rejoin the party, not for some grand confrontation, but because I needed one thing, not their approval, just the truth, on paper. By the time I reached my car, the music from the venue had faded into nothing but a dull hum behind closed doors. I didn't look back. Instead, I unlocked the door, slid into the seat, and let the silence wrap around me like a second coat. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stared at the steering wheel for a long while, thinking of my father's handwriting. Something had always tugged at the back of my mind. Quiet, persistent. The old beach house, the one with the fig tree out front and wind chimes made from driftwood. It was where he and I used to sneak away to when the rest of the world felt too loud. He called it our quiet. After he passed, Valora told me it had been sold, no explanation, just that it was gone. But lately, things hadn't been adding up. A distant cousin had mentioned, in passing, that they drove by it last summer and saw a "for rent" sign with Valora's name on it. I'd brushed it off at the time, chalked it up to a mistake. But tonight, I couldn't brush anything off anymore. I typed the address of the county records office into my GPS and turned onto the highway, headed south along the coast road. The moon was low, hugging the dark ocean, waves barely visible through the windshield. That stretch of road had always felt like a portal, leading to somewhere older, deeper, home, almost, or what used to be. I passed the seafood shack where we'd stop for hush puppies and peach soda, the cracked white fence where my dad once dared me to jump barefoot just to prove I could. Every mile brought back something warm, something now bitter. The clerk at the county records office barely looked up when I stepped in. The building was a relic, flickering fluorescent lights, gray carpet that had seen better decades, and the scent of paper dust and cold coffee. "Hi," I said quietly. "I'm looking for property records, parcel 18B on Drift Hollow Lane, from about 10 years ago to now." He nodded, typed slowly, then disappeared into the back. I paced the lobby, read the same flyer on estate taxes 3 times. 15 minutes passed. Then he returned with a slim manila folder, set it on the counter, and handed me a pair of gloves. I sat down at one of the vinyl-covered chairs and opened it. The deed was still active, and my name was on it. Kalis M. Devereaux, listed as co-owner, with joint survivorship rights, filed 2 months before my father died. I stared at the date. I remembered that summer. The weekend he took me down to the coast and asked if I liked the sound of gulls in the morning. I thought he was being poetic. He wasn't. He was planning. And yet, here was a second file, a lease agreement, dated 3 years back. Valora had been collecting rent on the house through a shell company, Coastal Haven LLC. Her name didn't appear on the deed, but the leasing contract was signed, by her, as owner, $12,000 a month, for 36 months. No disclosures, no distribution of funds, no mention to me, ever. And then the tax forms, filed under her Social Security number, listing the beach house as investment property, full deduction claims. My breath caught in my chest. What kind of family steals a house that doesn't belong to them? Then came the document that made my fingertips go cold. A notarized form, claiming Valora as the sole surviving heir of the property. It had an outdated copy of the deed attached, no mention of me, and at the bottom, in the margin, barely visible in pencil, "Must keep her out of this." I blinked at the words, her handwriting. I knew it well. Looped letters the way she always dotted her I too high. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone and took photos, one by one, every page, every signature, every lie in black and white. What would you do if your own family faked legal papers to steal from you? Because at that moment, I didn't know whether to be angry or ashamed that I hadn't seen it sooner. I stepped outside into the early dusk. The coastal wind cut sharper than before, the sun beginning to dip behind the marsh. Across the street, parked under the drooping limbs of an old oak tree, sat a car. Black Lexus. Engine off. I didn't need to see the license plate. Lucas, Valora's husband. He didn't wave, didn't roll down the window, just sat there, hand resting on the steering wheel, face half-shadowed. And then, slowly, he pulled away, tires crunching over gravel. He knew I knew, and that changed everything. I didn't go straight home. I drove past it once, just kept going, all the way down to the edge of town where the gas station lights hummed and flickered like an old memory. I sat there for a bit, engine running, hands cold on the wheel, trying to slow the churn in my chest. I knew something would be waiting for me, I just didn't know what form it would take. When I finally turned back toward the house, the street was darker than usual. Most porch lights were off, blinds drawn tight. Our home sat at the end of the cul-de-sac, just like always. The windows looked warm, still, familiar. That steadiness I used to feel pulling into the driveway? Gone. I parked like I always did, slid my keys from the ignition, and walked up to the front door. Key in, twist, nothing. I tried again. Still nothing. At first, I thought maybe I grabbed the wrong set. Maybe I was too tired and missing something obvious. But no. It was my house key. The one with the worn edges and the tiny dent Mateo accidentally made with pliers years ago. It had always worked. Until now. I stepped back, looked at the house, and noticed something else. The garage door was half open, just a few feet off the ground, like someone had paused it mid-shut. I crouched and ducked under it. Inside were boxes, 3 of them labeled in Sharpie. K. Closet. K. Office stuff. K. Misc. My stomach flipped. The garage was cold, too quiet. A faint smell of cardboard and Lysol hung in the air. My eyes darted to the door leading inside the house. I tried that handle too. Locked. I knocked. Light at first, then harder. No answer. Then the porch light clicked off. Someone was watching. I walked back around the house trying to keep my breath steady. My palms were damp. I felt like a stranger walking up to a home that had already forgotten me. I was just about to knock again when the door cracked open. Mateo. His expression wasn't angry, just tired, measured, like he'd been preparing for this. "I didn't know if you'd come back tonight," he said, his voice quiet. "I live here," I replied, more out of reflex than confidence. He didn't open the door wider, didn't invite me in. "I need to talk to you," I said. "I know," he murmured. "Me too." I shifted my weight, waiting for him to say something more, but he just stared. Finally, I asked, "Why doesn't my key work?" He looked away. "I had the locks changed yesterday." The silence between us stretched and cracked. "Why?" I asked, barely recognizing my own voice. He swallowed hard, then leaned his shoulder against the doorframe. "Valora and your mother came to see me, a few days ago." I said nothing. They brought papers, medical records, from years ago, therapy notes. My chest tightened. I hadn't looked at those files in a decade, back when I was struggling with panic attacks after Dad died. Back when Mateo held my hand in waiting rooms and whispered, "You don't have to be perfect for me." "They said you've been showing signs again," he continued, "that you've been acting erratically, making things up, obsessing about money, property." "You believe them?" I asked. His eyes flicked up, then away. "I didn't know who to believe. I thought, maybe you were unraveling." I stared at him. "Unraveling?" I repeated. I needed to protect the house, the finances, everything. You've been going behind everyone's back, digging up old files, showing up at county offices. So instead of asking me, I said, stepping back a little, you locked me out, like a thief. He didn't say anything. Have you ever been betrayed by the person who once swore to protect you? I asked. The words weren't for him. They were for me. I turned and walked off the porch. My legs felt like sand. I sat down on the driveway curb. Concrete still held a bit of warmth from the day's sun. He stood at the door for a while, then stepped down slowly. I didn't look at him. I just said, "Why didn't you ask me first?" His reply came flat. "You'd just lie." It hit like a slap. Not loud, not violent, but final. I took off my wedding ring. My fingers trembled just slightly, but I set the band gently beside me on the step. Didn't say a word. A moment later, he returned with an envelope. White, thick, clean. He held it out. I didn't reach for it right away. "Divorce papers," he said. "Filed last week." I took the envelope. It had weight to it, legal weight, emotional weight. "Let's do this quietly," he said. "No one needs the drama." I looked up at him. Really looked. "You just picked your side," I said. Not angry, not loud, just true. He didn't respond, just turned and walked back inside, closing the door with a soft mechanical finality. The porch light above me flickered twice, then blinked off. The lights went out on the porch, and in my chest. I didn't remember walking. Only the rain soaking through my coat, the squish of gravel under my flats, and the ache in my hands from gripping that envelope. The bookstore was 5 blocks down, tucked between an old bakery and a boarded-up barber shop, both places I once visited with my dad on Sunday mornings. Funny how some buildings stay put when people don't. The alley behind the shop was narrow, and the metal door had always creaked open if you tugged it just right. I did, and it did. Inside smelled like yesterday's paper, wet wood, and something bittersweet. Maybe the memory of my father's cologne mixed with time. No one was around. Just me, a low bulb flickering overhead, and the hum of water dripping somewhere near the boiler. The back room hadn't changed much. Same cement floor, same stack of unopened donation bins, same old busted heater in the corner. I dropped my bag and slid down against the wall, pulling my coat tighter around me like a makeshift blanket. My phone was dead. My heart felt the same. Somewhere in the silence I imagined my dad again, sitting in the front corner of the store under the crooked reading lamp. He used to read Steinbeck to me aloud, even when I was too young to understand. "You don't need to understand every word," he'd say. "Just feel the weight of them." I felt it now, the weight of words, especially the ones never said. Sometime before sunrise, a quiet knock came at the back door. I jolted up, unsure if I'd actually slept. It was Harold, the man who'd taken over the store after Dad passed. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded at the boxes and motioned to a warm cup of coffee in his hand. "You all right?" he asked gently, crouching down. I nodded, barely. "You're welcome to rest here a bit, there's something left for you." He handed me a manila envelope. I didn't want to open it, but I did. Inside were court documents, a restraining order, filed by my mother-in-law. My fingers trembled. It stated I had verbally threatened her at the wedding, that I had emotional instability, and was a potential risk to the family. Risk? They were painting me like a stray dog with rabies. I stared at the pages, then at Harold. "Did she come here?" I asked. He looked down. "Dropped it off yesterday. Said you might show up. Said it was urgent. Urgent to erase me, apparently. They'd taken my home, my dignity, and now my name. They were laying a new narrative brick by brick, and I wasn't even invited to speak. I wanted to scream, but nothing came. My throat tightened, but I stayed still, silent. The kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from pain so old it knows how to hold its breath. Have you ever been betrayed by the person who once swore to protect you? Later that morning, Harold brought out a few crates of book donations and asked if I wanted to help sort. I nodded, needing something, anything, to keep my hands moving, my mind from spiraling. We sat side by side at the long wooden table, sorting hardbacks from paperbacks, kids' books from adult fiction. My fingers landed on a trash bag labeled unsellable. Inside were old holiday cookbooks, crumpled paperbacks, a few torn jackets, and then something soft. My breath caught. I pulled it out. A quilt, pale blue, hand-stitched, with tiny embroidered stars around the edges. My initials were in the corner. KLH. The last thing my grandmother ever made. She'd told me once, "This is yours, sweetheart, when you're grown and need to remember where you come from." And here it was, in a trash bag, tossed in with moldy romance novels and coffee-stained journals. Valora. It had to be her. No one else would have had it. No one else would have thrown it out without a thought. I clutched the quilt to my chest. The stitches felt like tiny heartbeats. I pressed my face into the fabric, breathing in whatever pieces of my grandmother still lived in the threads. I didn't cry loudly, just sat there, shoulders still, tears finding their own way down. No words, just a quiet kind of heartbreak. That night, Harold let me use the break room to charge my phone. I plugged it in, expecting spam messages or silence. But when the screen lit up, I saw dozens of missed notifications, group chats I was no longer part of, emails I didn't want to open, and one voicemail from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me press play. "Kalis, don't say my name, please, but I know what they did. I saw it. The night before the wedding, Valora, her mother, and Matteo, I heard them. I know what they're doing. I can prove it. But you have to trust me. Don't tell anyone I called." It was Jonah, Matteo's cousin, barely 21, always quiet at family gatherings, the one who always looked away during the shouting but never laughed along. He never said much, but when he did, it meant something. I stared at the phone. The message ended. Nothing else. No number to call back. But my breath hitched, not from fear, from something else. A crack. A splinter of light under the door. And just like that, the door cracked open. Jonah stepped inside, closing it quickly behind him to keep the rain out. He looked nervous but steady. I nodded for him to sit down at the little cafe table I'd claimed by the window. My coffee had long gone cold, untouched. But my thoughts? They'd been burning. He placed a small flash drive on the table between us. No words yet, just that. "I thought you should see it with your own eyes," he said softly. I picked it up without a word and slid it into my laptop. The folder popped open with a click. Dozens of screenshots, names, timestamps. One read, "She's always been fragile. Just nudge her a bit and watch the cracks." Another, "Don't worry, Valora. Once she snaps at the wedding, we've got it all recorded. Mental instability plus aggression, restraining order, no inheritance worries." I couldn't look away. Valora, Matteo, even Lily. Their private group chat, months before the wedding, was a blueprint, not just betrayal, a setup. Jonah leaned forward. "They used me too, Kalis. I thought I was helping with logistics. I didn't know, I swear. Not until that moment. When she threw the mic at you? That's when I realized they were trying to make you explode on purpose." I looked up at him. My voice came out even, maybe too calm. "They wanted to turn me into a villain. And now they want to rewrite the whole story, without me in it." He nodded, guilt in his eyes. "You deserve to know everything." I closed the laptop and took a long breath. Outside, the rain kept falling in soft, steady lines. We sat in silence for a while before I finally asked, "Do you remember if the bookstore still has the security footage from 2 weeks ago?" He blinked. "The one before the wedding?" I nodded. I have a feeling Matteo left more than just words behind. We left the cafe and walked the short block to the bookstore. The rain had slowed, but the wind still carried that sharp bite that gets into your bones. Inside, the owner, Mrs. Hemley, was behind the counter restocking used paperbacks. She looked up, surprised to see me again so soon. "Back for more peace and quiet?" she asked with a kind smile. "Actually," I said, lowering my voice, "do you still keep the security tapes?" She hesitated. "We usually overwrite them every few weeks, but If it's the main system drive, we might still have that weekend's batch. Come, let's check. We went into the back office. Jonah stayed outside the room, giving us space. She powered up the old monitor, humming thoughtfully. The screen flickered, then showed a black and white feed. Her fingers clicked through dates until she stopped on a Friday evening, 3 days before the wedding. There, I leaned in. Mateo. Walking in like he owned the place. Calm, not looking around nervously like someone breaking in. He went straight to the back, opened my father's old desk drawer with a key he shouldn't have had. His movements were quick, practiced. He pulled out a red folder. I stared. That folder had held my father's personal documents, unfinished drafts of his will, old letters, journal entries. He'd written down everything, every version, before finalizing the one that had disappeared. I swallowed the ache rising in my chest. They wanted to erase me from every angle, I whispered. Legally, emotionally, historically. When we left, I didn't speak until we were halfway down the block. The clouds had thinned, letting in streaks of pale light, but my chest was still heavy. Jonah, I said, stopping near the corner, do you know why this doesn't break me anymore? He waited. Because I don't feel anything for him now. Not anger, not grief, just quiet, like a door finally closed. I exhaled. They tried to destroy me like I was fragile glass. But glass isn't the only thing that breaks. Truth can crack through steel if you time it right. He gave me a look I couldn't quite read. Maybe admiration, maybe sadness. I went back to the bookstore alone after we parted ways. Mrs. Hemley let me sit in the back again, in that same spot near the old donation pile. My body still ached from nights on the floor, but my mind was sharper than it had been in weeks. I pulled out the folder I'd started building, clippings, scanned images, the restraining order, and now the footage. And from the lining of the quilt, just hours earlier, I had found one last piece. A notarized letter. My father's handwriting. Dated 6 weeks before he passed. To Kalis, it began. If this letter reaches you, something went wrong. But know this, my records are stored not in trust, but in truth. You'll know when the time comes. And maybe that time was now. I attached the letter to the front of the folder. No ribbon, no flair, just facts. The final touch? I opened the messages again, found Jonah's thread and typed 5 words. I'm ready. Let's expose them. Jonah didn't respond right away. He looked at me, then at the phone, then back at me again. I nodded once, just once, and that was all he needed. He rose without a word and reached for his coat. Outside, the night had turned heavy with fog and drizzle, as if even the sky was bracing for what was about to unfold. We didn't speak during the short ride to the restaurant. The tires hummed over wet pavement, and the city lights blurred behind the streaked windshield. I rested my hand on the envelope in my lap, the one with my father's will, his final letter, and the footage. My pulse was steady, my thoughts even steadier. The valet barely glanced at us when we arrived. Jonah opened the door for me, and I stepped out onto the cobblestone driveway, my heels clicking sharp against the ground. Inside the private dining room, low lighting and hushed murmurs floated behind thick oak doors. This was their post-wedding celebration, Valora and Mateo's chance to bask in the glow of deception. I walked in without knocking. 12 heads turned at once. Glasses froze mid-air. Forks stilled over plates. Mateo stiffened in his chair. Valora's lips parted, but no words came. Lily sat near the corner, her eyes wide, her shoulders tense. You weren't invited, Valora hissed, her voice sharp with forced calm. Then I ignored her. Instead, I placed the sealed envelope on the center of the table. My fingers didn't tremble. Then don't open this, unless you're ready. Mateo stood, reaching for it with that same entitled urgency he always carried, but Jonah stepped forward, blocking him. It's addressed to everyone, he said simply. There was silence, like the pause before a match is struck. I broke the seal and pulled out my father's letter first. The room had gone still. I'll read it for you, I said, since none of you were there when he wrote it. The letter wasn't long. My father's handwriting, strong, careful, spelled out what he'd never had the chance to say aloud. He spoke of regret, of how he let others divide his house. He apologized for the silence he'd allowed to grow between us. And then he wrote one line that made Valora flinch. She was never the beggar. They were just too proud to see the builder. When I lifted the will next, the mood shifted. My father had left me the bookstore, the family house, his stocks. Everything they believed was meant for Valora. Valora's voice broke through the hush. He promised that to me. He said I would carry the family legacy. I glanced at her. He did, until he saw what legacy you were building. Jonah stepped toward the table and tapped his phone. The screen lit up, a grainy security video from the bookstore. Mateo's face flickered into view, caught entering after hours, rifling through drawers, taking a red folder. I didn't say a word. I let the silence carry the weight. Mateo's jaw clenched. Valora looked between him and the screen, the color draining from her cheeks. I never touched anything, Mateo said stiffly. That could be anyone. Your watch is visible, I cut in. The one with your initials. You wore it to the rehearsal dinner. There are pictures. Then, almost too calmly, Valora picked up a manila folder and slid it across the table. She's lying. She's unstable, diagnosed, a threat to herself. This is her psych evaluation. She shouldn't even be here. Gasps. A few turned toward me. Someone muttered something I didn't catch. Jonah, without flinching, opened a folder of his own. He laid out two identical-looking documents side by side, then pointed. This one, he said, tapping the left, was notarized 8 months ago. It's from a licensed therapist who found no grounds for concern. This one, he pointed to the right, was printed yesterday, at Valora's office. See the header? The printer code's embedded. I traced it. Valora opened her mouth, then shut it. Her hands clenched in her lap. Mateo leaned forward, but before he could speak, Aunt Felice, our father's sister, stood. What are you two doing? She whispered. What did you do? Valora tried to scoff, but her voice cracked. This isn't real. This is some kind of setup. I stayed seated. I didn't raise my voice. You called me a stain, a burden. You said I was charity. I looked straight at her. But you forgot something. She glared. What? I stood. Slowly. Even a beggar knows how to survive in a storm. You've just been pretending you weren't soaking wet. The silence in that room was thunderous. Faces shifted. Some turned away. Lily looked down at her plate. Mateo slammed his palm against the table. You think you've won? Jonah stepped between us again. You've already lost. You just haven't accepted it yet. Valora stood up so fast her chair scraped. This isn't over! I turned back toward the door. My voice was even, certain. It is! Valora screamed, This isn't over! I didn't flinch. I turned back, met her eyes, and said, steady and quiet, It is. That night I didn't sleep much, not from fear, not from regret, but from the kind of stillness that finally feels earned. I sat by the window until dawn, a cup of tea going cold in my hand, watching the shadows on the floor lengthen and shrink again. The house was silent, but not empty. It was mine now, in name, in presence, in peace. A few days later, I found myself standing in the old bookstore again. The keys had been turned over to me officially. The air inside still carried the scent of paper and wood polish. I walked through the quiet aisles, letting my fingers trail along the spines of books that had sat there longer than I'd been alive. In the back storage room, behind dusty filing cabinets and forgotten promotional signs, I saw a velvet bundle wedged on a high shelf. I reached for it slowly, carefully. When I unwrapped it, my breath caught. It was my father's microphone. Brass. Heavy. A little tarnished but whole. I remembered him standing at the little podium near the front window years ago, reciting poetry to no one and everyone. He once told me, if your voice shakes, Kalis, it just means what you're saying matters. I'd forgotten that moment, but now, in the hush of the room, it came back like sunlight breaking through the clouds. I took the mic home that afternoon, polished it with an old cloth and lemon oil until it shone like it used to. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I just knew I had to do it. 1 week later, a modest community center just outside town opened its doors early on a Saturday morning. Warm sunlight spilled through the tall windows, pooling on the floor like gold. I stood near a folding table set with a stack of my handmade chapbooks, poems, short stories, things I used to scribble in margins and hide under my bed. Jonah was there, helping me set up the folding chairs. A few neighbors filtered in, then more. Faces I recognized from the bakery, the post office, even from Valora's wedding, oddly enough. A cousin of hers gave me a small nod and sat near the back. I didn't expect that. I didn't need it. But I noticed. When it was time, I stepped up with the microphone. It hummed softly in my hands, not with power, but with memory. "Good morning," I began, and let the silence carry me. "Today's not about revenge, it's about reclaiming space and voice." I opened a worn folder and pulled out a sheet of paper. It was one of my father's last poems. Unfinished. Half a stanza, really. I'd found it tucked behind the cash register, written in his unmistakable slant. I read the lines slowly, carefully, letting each word land. Then I added the last line myself. "Even silence carries truth, if you let it echo." I didn't look up right away. I let the words breathe. Applause didn't explode, it unfolded. Gentle, real. Afterward, Jonah approached quietly and handed me a small envelope. "They started the investigation," he said. "Valora's being subpoenaed for document forgery, evidence tampering too." I exhaled, not with triumph, but with relief. "And Mateo?" I asked. "Stepped down. Word is, the board forced him." Quietly. I nodded and placed the envelope under my stack of papers. "I never wanted them to suffer," I said. "I just didn't want to disappear again." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You didn't." We cleaned up together, laughing softly as a few of the chairs creaked and refused to fold back properly. As I wiped down the mic and wrapped its cord carefully, I felt something settle in my chest. Not closure, something better. Continuity. Later that afternoon, I drove out to the cemetery. The grass was overgrown near the edge of my father's headstone, but the stone itself was clean. I knelt beside it and placed the microphone at its base. The brass gleamed under the slanted light. "They tried to make me feel like I was nothing," I whispered. "But you taught me that stillness isn't weakness." I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't moved, but because the ache had finally unknotted itself. I stood slowly. In the distance, I could see the small reading stage outside the community center. A mother stood beside her daughter, maybe 8 or 9, holding up a note card as the girl read a poem aloud into the very mic I'd just used. Her voice was wobbly, but steadying with every word. I watched them for a moment longer, then turned and walked away. Sometimes the best mic drop is just walking away with your head held high.